Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and today we're going to be talking about the fight to end long-term solitary confinement in New York State. So just this month, a bill called the Halt Solitary Confinement Act was signed into law. And this law does a number of things, but one of the most important components is that it prohibits the use of solitary confinement or anything that looks like it for more than 15 days. And this is important because while solitary is an inhumane practice no matter how long it's used for, more than 15 days is so egregious that the UN has defined it as torture. But despite that restriction, New York is the first and only state that has prohibited it for more than 15 days. And before this prohibition, there essentially were no limits on how long someone could stay in solitary confinement. And we've seen how these lack of restrictions in the past have caused real harm and damage to people who are incarcerated. People like Kalief Browder, who spent 2 years in solitary confinement on Rikers Island while he was awaiting trial for allegedly stealing a backpack. Now, you probably know his story by now. Prosecutors ultimately dropped the charges, but only after he was subjected to years of trauma, abuse, and torture. And 2 years after his release from Rikers, Kalief Browder died by suicide. And we also saw the story of Leilin Polanco, a transgender woman who suffered from seizures and died in solitary confinement when she was incarcerated on $500 bail for a low-level misdemeanor. Now, I want to talk through some of the things that this law does to help folks so that they don't have to be in that situation. First, it specifically bars youth, pregnant women, elderly, and people who have serious mental illness from being placed in solitary confinement. It also creates residential rehabilitation units, or RRUs, to provide people who are incarcerated with a therapeutic and trauma-informed setting that can actually promote rehabilitation. And it also establishes a minimum amount of time that people who are in those RRUs must be given outside of their cell in a congregate setting where there is therapeutic programming or recreation. And what's really exciting about this law is that supporters of it say that it will reduce the total number of people incarcerated in solitary confinement by 50%. So for more on the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, I'm joined now by Daiwan Tatro, Senior Advisor of Strategic Outreach for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and a leading advocate for the HALT Act, and Victor Pate, statewide organizer with the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. Daiwan, Victor, it's really a pleasure to have both of you here today.
Alana, thank you for having us.
So it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with both of you, particularly because you both have experienced firsthand the traumatic effects of solitary confinement and incarceration. And I know that you've both taken that work into your advocacy to push for a better model. So talk to us about how your experiences have informed what you know about the dark legacy of solitary confinement, both in New York and across the nation. On this one, I'll start with you, Daiwan.
I think that one of the main misconceptions about solitary confinement is that it is necessary, right? If you talk to the people at the Department of Corrections, they say that we need this as a mechanism to keep people safe. Having spent 12 years in prison, I can tell you myriad stories about the people who are in solitary confinement and what they're there for. I spent time in solitary confinement while incarcerated for leaving my hot pot on, right? I didn't attack anyone. I wasn't attacked. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't pose a threat, a danger to anyone. I left the cell, left my plastic hot pot on. It melted. I went to solitary confinement. There are instances of individuals being in solitary confinement for having too many stamps, for having too many books, for having too much food in their cell, right? And so that misconception up front is one I really, really want to deconstruct. Solitary confinement is not necessary to keeping people safe, right? Alana, as you said in your opening, it is torture. And I'm so happy that we've brought a halt to it here in New York. One of the things I think about every day, especially working in the criminal justice space, is the fact that we've done a lot of things to prevent people from going to prison, right? We've done some things to get people out of prison. We've done very little thing for the people who are currently incarcerated. So halt solitary is going to fundamentally change how incarcerated people serve their time. You don't have to wake up every day knowing that a CO can send you to solitary confinement for the smallest infraction, right? People don't have to live with that fear. They don't have to live with the fear of being tortured. And to me, that's one of the biggest things that come from this bill, right? It's going to impact the day-to-day quality of life for incarcerated people. Prisons are fundamentally inhumane, but solitary confinement is torture.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, no. So I was just going to say, and thank you so much for that, Dawan. And as one of the New York statewide organizers for the whole solitary confinement campaign, been with the campaign just about from its inception, and working on this for 8 years. I guess at first started, we just really we really were looking almost like climbing up a gigantic mountain, because as has been pointed out, this is the stick with which corrections feel it is necessary to keep people in line, or to keep discipline people, to break you, so to speak, because that's the only purpose that solitary confinement serves, is to break you and cause you to either lose your mind or become incapable of functioning either in the facility or once you are released to a facility. So this is something that, I'm saying, after an 8-year struggle and so many hurdles to get over, I'm just so glad that we were finally able to be successful with getting this bill passed. And it's been no easy task, because when you fight against industrial complex as wide and vast as the prison industrial complex, you have a lot of forces against you that want things to remain the same as they are, because there stands to be a benefit. Because, as you know, prisons is money. That's why it's called the prison industrial complex. The people that are in there are commodities to be used, to benefit, to make money, to profiteer from. And anything that resembles any form of change, it seems to the corrections official as if you are challenging the system, and things will not be the same. That means that they can no longer continue to do the things that they've been doing. So I just wanted to just drop that in right quick, so we can continue.
Yeah, this idea that I've heard this from people who are opposed to this law, where they basically say, well, on the outside, when someone breaks the law, we send that person to jail or prison. But when somebody is in prison, they'll say, this is the only way we have to keep people safe, the same way jail and prisons are the only way we have to keep people safe. And Victor, it sounds like what you're saying is, this is just correction officers sort of clinging to their way of holding on to power. So I'm curious but I found that a lot of lawmakers found that argument to be effective, this argument of like, we need a prison within a prison for when people break the rules. How would you respond to that when you received that sort of pushback from either people on the opposition or lawmakers or anyone else?
Yeah, and I'll be quick, because I want to give that one opportunity to weigh in too. So when you talk about I'm saying, them saying that, oh, we need this as a means to keep misbehaving incarcerated people in line, and that there's no other way for this to be done other than placing people in a situation where they are alone for 23, 24 hours a day, with no other human contact, and no interaction with any other persons. And you say this you need in order to maintain discipline or safety and or security of a facility. That argument doesn't make sense. How do you justify helping or making a person become better by placing them in a situation where there's deprivation and isolation? How does that help a person to even address whatever their behavioral issues may be, by you separating them, totally isolating. But not even that, but what happens to a person while they're in solitary confinement, the abuse that happens, the neglect that happens. I mean, things of this nature that happens to people being in solitary confinement does not do anything for a person's behavior. It doesn't make them act better once they get out. As a matter of fact, it causes a person to be worse than they were before they went in. So how do you justify using solitary confinement as a means of discipline when only purpose it serves is punitiveness and abuse? That just doesn't make sense, and that's a poor reason or excuse to even have solitary confinement exist.
So I want to talk a little bit about the politics of moving this bill forward. And to do that, first, I want to say, Daiwan, I love the way that you that this all happened, and I'll give some background to our viewers. So we at the Appeal put out an article that was called "Cuomo Signs Off on 2 Big Wins for Criminal Justice Reform." And Daiwan, you responded to that tweet saying, "Cuomo, is this something we give him credit for?" Talk to us about why he does not deserve credit here.
Yeah, so first, just want to thank the Appeal for kind of immediately changing that headline to something more appropriate to the situation. But one of the things that we've seen for the past 8 years here in New York is the Halt Solitary campaign has raged, to end solitary confinement in New York State prison because it's a form of torture, is that the Cuomo administration has effectively stonewalled the passage of that bill for years and years and years. And so finally this year, it took 8 years of organizing, 8 years of advocacy, 8 years of people suffering the deprivation of solitary confinement to get us to a point where this bill could pass. It took the election of a Democratic supermajority to the state Senate to vote this bill through in a veto-proof way. And it also took the multiple scandals engulfing the governor to put him in a weak enough position where he didn't feel secure enough to veto this bill, right? And so there's a lot of things coming together at the right time just to bring about some basic human dignity in this prison system. And so Cuomo waited for the 10th hour, 11th hour, 12th hour, ran time all the way down on the clock to sign the bill. He signed it with a few chapter amendments. They don't change the core of the heart of the whole solitary legislation, but he deserves zero credit for signing that bill. And just really want to be explicit here and point to the fact that as a governor, as the executive in this state who oversees the Department of Correction, Andrew Cuomo has had the unilateral power to end solitary confinement in New York State all along, since his first day on the job. This is not something that needed to happen legislatively, right? It had to happen legislatively in the way that it did with a supermajority in the Senate because he opposed it. And he opposed it because this is fundamentally going to change the prison system in New York State. There are whole prisons dedicated to housing people in solitary confinement, where individuals have been sitting in a cell 23-1 a day for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years, decades at a time. And there's the potential that this is going to close more prisons upstate. And so the governor, in his weakened position, didn't want to sign this bill because he doesn't want to, at this moment, right, jeopardize his support of upstate legislators. But he also couldn't veto it because then this Democratic Senate supermajority would have reversed that veto and further weakened his position. So he took a fallback position, added some chapter amendments. They don't change the core of the bill. This is a win for advocates and activists on the ground and for the people that have suffered solitary confinement and for all of our state legislators who just this year visited prison after prison, solitary confinement unit after solitary confinement unit to get proximity to the problem, to advocate and advance this legislation.
And speaking of all of those advocacy efforts, I want to talk a little bit about, I mean, this is a really transformational piece of legislation, really the only one of its kind in the country. And so I can imagine that there are advocates in different states, different cities who are looking at this and thinking, how do we do this where I live? So Victor, talk to us about sort of the lessons you've learned from organizing around this effort and what advice you would give people in other states wanting to do the same. And also, Daiwan, feel free to jump in here too. There's no strict rules.
Yeah. So thank you so much, and thank you again, Daiwan, for that information. So my advice: never give up, never give in, never retreat. Because if you are committed to getting, the goal, reaching that goal line, you have to keep running down that field until you reach that goal line. I think that, all along, I guess, and I have to speak for myself on this here, that, what I always think about is that those of them that are still there are those of them that may eventually wind up there. None of the work that I ever done in any reforms have ever been for myself. It's always been for those of them that have been left behind, or those of them might wind up in it. And I guess that in doing this work, that you have to you have to really have in your mind, in your heart, in your soul, that this can happen. You have to believe in what you're doing. You have to believe in humanity. You have to believe in that right will always supersede wrong. It may sometimes seem as though it's a long, hard fight, but if you hang in there in the fight, eventually good will supersede evil. And in this case, this is exactly what happened. That one mentioned, just to mention what he said in terms of the long period of time, and you probably remember this in 2019, they were supposed to bring the HALT bill to the floor for a vote. It did not happen. Why didn't it not happen? Because Governor Cuomo went in with the Senate and the Assembly, and he had put forth a list of proposed administrative regulations that he was proposing that he was going to implement if they didn't bring the HALT bill to the floor for a vote. He tried to derail us, and he did in some small manner, because the bill never got brought to the floor for a vote. But we did not go away. We did not fold up our tents. We did not give up the fight. And we continued to do what we was doing until we eventually reached the goal. So my advice for other states, other advocates, and anybody that's pushing for any type of criminal justice, humanity, reforms, that people be treated humanely, that they stay in the fight. Stay in the fight. That's my advice. Stay in the fight. Don't give up. Don't give in. Don't retreat, no matter how difficult it is. Because one of our strongest components was NYSCOBA, New York State Correctional Officers Benevolent Association, one of his biggest financial supporters to his campaign. They were in his ear all of the time that he was fighting us. All of the time he was shaking his head saying, no, no, no. All the time he was trying to figure out ways to derail the whole solitary confinement campaign. They were in his ear, and they're a pretty strong union. Law enforcement agencies. We had all of these, gargantuan agencies and entities that was against the people. And I always say that it's we the people who have to be involved and have to be engaged in this change. And I think that if we the people can show that we are united as a people, because we had people of all color that was a part of this campaign, all ethnic backgrounds, racial, religion. I mean, we had some of everybody. I don't think nobody that wasn't engaged or involved. And I think that is a combination of all the people, we the people. This is what helped us get where we are and helped us become successful. And I think that that's part of the driving force in any movement, in any campaign for it to be successful.
Yeah, and Alana, I'll just add, I'm really interested in seeing how this reverberates across the country. I'm always particularly concerned about prison conditions. Again, we can do things to keep people out of the system. We can do things to get more people out of the system, stop people from going in. But we also have to be worried about the people stuck in the middle, the people who are incarcerated. So if we look back just a few years here in New York, we saw that New York City became the first city in the country, and that movement is led by Bianca Tylik over at Reins to make phone calls free, right? And so now we're the first state to ban solitary confinement in a real and robust way. And what we've seen across this country is that phone calls in jail, the exploitation of incarcerated people around phone charges, those calls are free now in San Francisco. They're free in San Diego. It's on the verge of becoming free statewide in Connecticut. Again, where Rises has been working on that nationally. And so with all these campaigns, I think they stand as a symbol. Once we get a win somewhere and, lay the groundwork for how these campaigns can be run, for how we can change narratives and public consciousness around an issue, we can take that and emulate it and replicate it in other places. So, I'm really interested in seeing this model rolled out across the nation.
Mm-hmm. And that's good. Yeah.
And I want to follow up on that. I know you've spent a lot of time, just as you said, not only focusing on depopulating prisons, but also focusing on, the conditions of prisons, including education within prisons, and also right now this campaign, solitary confinement, ending it. So something I wanted to talk about a little bit. So in this model, it's replaced, not completely replaced, because you still have people who can be isolated for 15 days. But after 15 days with this RRU, can you talk a little bit about what you imagine that's going to look like and what it will take for the state for the state to get there?
Yeah, and I'd love to get Victor's input on this, but creating these rehabilitation units, I think is important, because we need to realize that prisons in this country are about punishment, right? 95% of the people incarcerated in America are returning back to society. And we need to constantly asking ourselves, how do we want those people to return? And how do we foster ways that they can return as them whole selves? People being locked in long-term solitary confinement doesn't serve our societal goals of that, right? But in relation to the residential rehabilitation units, I'm really, really curious to see what those are going to look like moving forward. One of the things that we've constantly seen in the advocacy community from the Department of Corrections, from the state, is that they will put nice labels on these things. Residential rehabilitation units sound nice, right? That sounds like these are things that are going to serve a good purpose in the world, but there are ways that these things can be really, really harmful to the individuals incarcerated within them. And so, the whole solitary campaign is not going to stop here today, right? It didn't stop with the passage of the legislation. We're going to continue to have to advocate around prison conditions and how people are treated within those units, right? Because the system is not going to correct itself. It's going to take constant pressure, constant advocacy, constant bringing the light of day to these RRUs in order for those environments to really be about rehabilitation and not punishment.
And that's good. And just to add a little context, and thank Juan for that there. So, of course, what comes now, and I always say this here, even after a bill is passed and signed, guess what? The real work starts then. So everything we did was kind of sort of like the prelude. Guess what? Now that the bill is passed, now we're talking about implementation, but we're also talking about oversight and monitoring, which is going to really be key here. And Daquan made reference to that there. So you asked about the residential rehabilitative unit. So you're talking about 7 hours out of cell time. You're talking about 5 hours congregate programmatic time, right? And into meaningful interactive time that have real rehabilitative and therapeutic programming, staff-led as well as peer-led program, because you can't leave everything up to docs, because Daquan said this, and I know from our experience, we've seen this movie before, that if you give them any wiggle room, they will change everything up. It will be nothing like it was supposed to be. So when you're talking about the residential rehabilitative units, a specialized unit, right? Nothing looking like solitary confinement, right? Where you will have counselors, therapists, social workers, and also peers. And I'm talking about people that are incarcerated themselves, that have designed programs, that run programs, that will be taking an active part in program curriculum to address the underlying behavioral issues that people might be needed to be separated from after they've been in after they've met their 15-day maximum, and then they transfer it to the residential rehabilitative, where they will get real meaningful programs, not just run-of-the-mill program. I mean meaningful, effective programming to address the issues that need to be addressed that might have gotten them in that particular unit. And I'm not talking about just any program that docs can come up with, because these programs are going to be specifically designed by professionals, by people that have been formerly incarcerated themselves, by people that have actually ran successful programs, and some of the programs that are actually still in effect in some of these facilities today. So that's when we're talking about the real residential rehabilitative units, and make it real. But the way it's going to be made real is that people who have expertise, who have proven track records, are going to be responsible for designing the curriculum and the program. And more importantly, and I think this is key, that we have people that have direct impact on peers, other people that are incarcerated, that have run design programs to assist people in the transformative process that needs to happen while they're in there, as well as once they are released from there, either back to population and or back to society. But like I say, the most crucial time between now and implementation period will be the programmatic design, the curriculum, and definitely the oversight. And I'm not saying, the bill has been passed and it's signed. Okay, abracadabra, it's all done. Everything is fixed. There's no more long-term solitary confinement. You can't expose people to torture. You can't just throw people in solitary without a correct, proper hearing, without them having a representation of their choice. I think that's a key matter, having the appropriate representation, because like Daiwan, you and I both know that when you go to those hearings, man, and you talking about kangaroo court. I think it's kangaroo court on steroids. So that's what it actually looks like for us at this time.
So something that I've been thinking about a little bit is the fact that, this bill, again, is the furthest in the country, and that's a big step forward. But it doesn't end solitary confinement altogether. And I think, for example, Layleen Polanco wasn't in there for 15 days before she died. And so I'm wondering if there were conversations about ending it altogether, and sort of if there is going to be sort of a next push for that to be the next step, and how you think that can happen. And I'll open this up to Daiwan.
Yeah. I don't think there's anyone in the advocacy activist community who wouldn't have wanted this to be a bill to fundamentally abolish solitary confinement, right? Because it is torture. But the politics around this issue, I don't think we're going to allow a bill like that to pass, even at this juncture. It took a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, tears, the death of people like Kalief Browder, of Layleen Polanco, even to get us to this point, right? And so we have a bigger problem around mass incarceration in this country. And if we just need to continue to depopulate and decarcerate. And I think if the prison population here in New York is dropping by the 1,000 kind of each year. We're down 40% just over the past year. And so I think that is going to get us to a place overall where these type of mechanisms are no longer necessary. But I'd love for us tomorrow, to ban solitary confinement outright. But the reason that can't happen, again, is because the prison system in this country is fundamentally inhumane and about punishment. it serves to punish people. And so until that system is abolished, until that system is fundamentally changed, I'm afraid that mechanisms like this, in all of their variations, right, whether it's bad prison food, whether it's solitary confinement, whether it's the exploitation of incarcerated people by prison profiteers, are going to continue to persist.
And one thing that I've learned in doing advocacy work is that the road to abolishment is incremental, and Taiwan made reference to that. And somebody's once said to me, he said, "How do you devour an elephant? One piece at a time." So if that's the road that is necessary to be taken to eventually completely abolish solitary, then we'll take that road. Because if it takes us one piece at a time, a small win here, a small win there, eventually it begins to whittle down. It becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it no longer exists. So for me, and I'm quite sure a lot of the other advocates that are even addressing different components of the prison industrial complex, we can do it a little bit at a time, and it's a real reality. But like Daquan pointed to, the politics of the time, the mass incarceration system that we're dealing with just not won't allow it just at this particular time. But I'm quite sure that as long as we continue to be on the road to whittle it down a little bit at a time, we will eventually reach our ultimate goal, which is total abolishment.
Well, before you go and devour the rest of that elephant, I hope you both enjoy your weekend, take a victory lap, because the work that you've done is really phenomenal. So thank you both for being here today, and keep on your fight.
Thank you for the work that you're doing, Daquan. I'll see you at the next
Victor,
session.
I'll see you around. Always a pleasure.
All right, buddy. Thank you. Have a good one.
So thinking about solitary confinement is something that's really heavy. And I think because it's really one of the most depraved forms of torture that this country still utilizes on a large scale. And if you had any thought in your mind that jails and prisons were meant for rehabilitation, just look at a solitary confinement cell. It is exactly what you would imagine torture to be in its purest form. The UN has said that it is torture. And still, it's occurring across the country. And just until now, long-term solitary confinement was allowed in New York. And it's a shame that it took so long, but it's important that we had such incredible advocates who pushed after it not being brought to the floor, who pushed after the governor refused to allow this bill to move forward. Who are able to gain the people power, who are able to get the right legislators in office, who are able to vote in favor of that bill. Because something that's also really important to note about solitary, and again, that both of our guests told us today, is that it's just not effective. And there have been studies of, for example, supermax prisons that show that there's no real difference between safety when you hold someone in solitary versus when you don't. In fact, it can make things worse because that person suffers deep, traumatic psychological abuse as a result of it. And for what? For leaving a hot plate on? For having too many stamps? It's a model that we should be looking to get rid of all throughout the country, and should be looking to New York as a leader in how to do that, and specifically to the directly impacted advocates who have pushed for that move forward. So thank you so much for tuning in today to the Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We'll see you next time.